The faint scent of lemon oil and anxious sweat always followed Clara through the marble-lined corridors of the Rossi estate. Lately, though, something heavier trailed her too. Secrets. She believed her oversized dresses and downcast eyes made her invisible. She believed slipping a stack of unmarked bills to a quiet suburban clinic had erased every trace of the life growing inside her. She believed she still had time. She was wrong. You cannot hide a secret from the man who controls the city's pulse. Matteo Rossi hadn't just discovered his shy, curvy maid was pregnant. He'd already bought out the clinic and intercepted her original files before the ink dried. And when she finally worked up the courage to face him in the private library, he was already waiting, holding a sonogram of twins. She didn't even know yet. If you're already invested in Clara's story like I am, go ahead and subscribe now. This channel is home to stories just like this one, where the quiet ones turn out to be the strongest. Let's rewind and see how it all began. The memory of 9 weeks ago hit her like a sudden, suffocating physical weight, instantly pulling her back into the terror and heat of that midnight storm. It had been a brutal Tuesday night in Chicago, the rain drumming relentlessly against the high, stained glass transoms of the Rossi estate. Clara had been finishing her late-night rounds in the Grand Library, gathering forgotten crystal snifters and smoothing the heavy velvet drapes, when the estate's heavy quiet shattered. The initial shock wasn't a thunderclap. It was the sharp, muffled pop of suppressed gunfire, echoing through the marble courtyard downstairs, followed immediately by the shattering of glass and frantic shouting. Clara's heart had leapt into her throat. She was just a housekeeper, a quiet, plus-sized girl hired to keep the brass polished and the hardwoods immaculate, not someone trained to navigate a war zone. She instinctively shrank back into the shadowed alcove of a mahogany bookcase, her hands trembling violently against her oversized apron. Then, the heavy oak doors of the study burst open. Matteo Rossi stumbled into the room, leaning heavily against the frame. The formidable, untouchable Don was clutching his left side, dark crimson spilling through the fingers of his white dress shirt. His breathing was a harsh, ragged growl. His jaw clenched so tightly the dark tattoos winding up his neck stood out in stark relief. In his right hand, his firearm gleamed under the dim amber lighting, but his posture was unsteady, an apex predator cornered by a sudden strike. When his pitch-black eyes swept the room and locked onto Clara, she saw a flash of raw, lethal instinct in his gaze. Any other servant would have screamed or fled to save themselves. But looking at the blood pooling across his knuckles and the dark exhaustion etched into his aristocratic features, something fierce and protective drowned out Clara's habitual timidity. Dropping her dusting cloths, she rushed forward. She caught his massive, muscular bulk, just as his knees buckled, bracing her heavy frame to take his weight. "This way, Mr. Rossi," she whispered urgently, her soft voice remarkably steady, despite her racing pulse. She guided his heavy frame toward the rear of the study, pressing a concealed release, hidden behind a bronze bust. A section of the wood paneling slid open, revealing a hidden, steel-reinforced safe room built for emergencies. Once they stumbled inside, the heavy door sealed shut behind them, instantly muting the chaos and shouting outside. The space was dim, smelling of leather, rain, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. Matteo sank onto a leather lounge chair, his head falling back as a low groan escaped his lips. Clara dropped to her knees before him without hesitation. Her fingers, usually so hesitant and careful, moved with frantic purpose as she unbuttoned his ruined silk shirt. The wound was a deep bullet graze along his ribs, bleeding heavily but missing anything vital. Ripping clean strips from her cotton apron, she pressed down hard to stem the flow. "You should have run, Clara," Matteo rasped, his gravelly voice vibrating through the tight space. His dark eyes watched her through heavy lids, tracking the frantic rise and fall of her chest, the loose curls escaping her bun, and the gentle, focused expression on her flushed face. "I'm stopping the bleeding, sir. Keep still," she murmured, focusing entirely on her task. As her hands worked over his warm skin, pressing the makeshift bandages against his torn flesh, the raw adrenaline filling the small room shifted. The danger outside faded, replaced by an as suffocating electric heat. Matteo's breathing hitched, not from the pain of the wound, but from the sudden, agonizing closeness. His large, calloused hand suddenly moved, his ringed fingers wrapping gently around her plump wrist to stay her hand. Clara looked up, her hazel eyes wide with alarm, but there was no coldness in his face. His dark eyes burned with a feral, possessive intensity. "You're shaking," he murmured, his thumb stroking the soft skin of her inner wrist. I was frightened," she admitted in a breathless whisper. "Don't be," Matteo growled softly, using his grip to pull her closer, until her plush thighs pressed against his side. He didn't look past her as he usually did when pacing the estate corridors. He looked directly into her. His hand moved from her wrist to the side of her neck, his thumb tracing her full jawline before cupping her cheek. When his lips met hers, it was a sudden, overwhelming collision of hunger and relief. Clara gasped, and Matteo pulled her flush against his hard frame. The ruthless dawn completely unraveled against her softness. He didn't want the razor-thin socialites who usually vied for his attention. He wanted her abundance. His large, tattooed hands mapped every curve of her plus-sized figure, gripping her soft waist and full hips with a desperate, worshipful strength. He treated her body like a sanctuary, praising every inch of her soft skin in low, dark Italian whispers. For the first time in her life, Clara felt no desire to hide behind oversized clothes. Under his touch, her softness felt sacred. But as the first gray light of dawn filtered through the reinforced transom, the spell shattered. The estate below had grown deathly quiet. Reality returned like an icy wave. Looking at the sleeping kingpin beside her, his possessive arm still draped heavy over her waist, terror seized her. She was just a maid. He was a man who ruled an empire through blood. Fearing she would wake to find his cold, distant authority returned, or worse, that she would be treated as a fleeting distraction, Clara carefully lifted his arm, gathered her torn uniform, and fled quietly into the morning shadows before he could open his eyes. Anyone else already feel for Clara here? Drop a comment below if you think she made the right call, or if you think she just made things so much worse for herself. I read every single one of them. The clinking of delicate porcelain against silver was the only sound cutting through the heavy, suffocating silence of the estate's main drawing room. Back in the present, Clara's hands trembled violently as she poured the dark, steaming Earl Grey into a bone china cup. Her stomach gave a violent, sickening lurch. The rich, bitter aroma of the hot tea, mixed with the lingering scent of espresso from the adjacent kitchen, hit her senses like a physical blow. She swallowed hard, clamping her jaw shut to force down the sudden wave of morning sickness. "Just finish pouring," she told herself frantically, keeping her eyes glued to the dark liquid. "Don't look at him. Don't let him see." She had intentionally wrapped her extra thick, heavy winter apron over her standard maid's dress, a stiff, layered piece of canvas that completely obscured the soft swell of her lower belly. It was late July in Chicago, and the humid summer heat hummed outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, but the thick fabric was her only shield. She was sweating beneath her dark, pinned-up curls, her skin pale and clammy, but she refused to take it off. "You missed your usual morning shift in the kitchen today, Clara," a deep, velvet voice rumbled from across the room. The sound sent a sharp, electric jolt straight down her spine. Clara froze, the silver teapot hovering an inch above the porcelain. Matteo Rossi sat in a high-backed, dark leather armchair by the unlit fireplace. He hadn't touched his own cup. His tailored suit jacket was off, his crisp white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, exposing the edge of the dark, intricate ink crawling up his neck. He was leaning forward, his large, ringed hands resting casually on his knees, watching her every move with the cold, hyper-focused intensity of an apex predator stalking prey. "My apologies, Mr. Rossi," Clara murmured, quickly setting the teapot down on the tray. She kept her head bowed, her hazel eyes fixed firmly on the polished hardwood floor. I wasn't feeling well this morning. I asked Martha to cover the breakfast prep. Is that so? Matteo said softly. The sheer weight of his presence seemed to pull all the oxygen out of the room. He stood up slowly, his towering muscular frame casting a long shadow across the plush oriental rug. Because Martha mentioned you ran out of the pantry the second she opened a fresh bag of dark roast coffee beans. She said you looked as though you'd seen a ghost. Clara's knuckles turned white as she clutched the edge of her heavy apron, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. My stomach has just been a bit sensitive lately, sir. A mild flu, I think. A flu, Matteo repeated, his voice dropping an octave as he took a slow, deliberate step toward her. The soft thud of his Italian leather shoes against the floor sounded like a countdown. And yet, you are wearing an apron thick enough to survive a Chicago blizzard in the middle of summer. You're sweating, Clara. Your skin is flushed. He stopped mere inches from her. The familiar, intoxicating scent of sandalwood, expensive tobacco, and pure, concentrated power enveloped her, making her knees go weak. I'm just feeling a chill, Mr. Rossi, she blurted out, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. She instinctively took a small step backward, her heavy thighs brushing against the serving cart, her hands flying defensively to cover the front of her layered waist. A flash of dark, possessive anger flickered in Matteo's pitch-black eyes, replaced instantly by an ominous, terrifying certainty. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently but firmly cupping her chin, his thumb pressing into her soft jawline to tilt her face up to his. You are a terrible liar, Piccola, he growled softly, his dark eyes searching her pale, trembling face with terrifying precision. I know every inch of this house. And I know every inch of you. Stop hiding from me. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, her breath catching in her throat, as she prayed he couldn't hear the frantic rhythm of her heart, or the silent truth hidden beneath her heavy apron. The muggy Chicago afternoon air did little to cool the fire of anxiety burning in Clara's chest. For the first time in months, she was out of her uniform, wearing a loose floral tunic and an oversized cardigan. She had taken her scheduled afternoon off, leaving the Rossi estate behind, or so she desperately hoped. To keep her trail invisible, she had avoided riding in any of the estate's town cars or hailing an Uber tied to a digital paper trail. Instead, she had walked 6 blocks in the stifling heat, bought a Metro card with crisp $20 bills, and taken the red line clear across town to a quiet suburban neighborhood. She carried a canvas tote bag filled with untraceable cash, saved over months of meticulous budgeting. Her destination was St. Jude's Women's Health, a discreet, private clinic tucked inside a modest brick building. She squeezed through the heavy glass doors, the chime above ringing softly as the refreshing blast of air conditioning washed over her flushed skin. Clara Vance? Paying out of pocket? The receptionist asked softly, looking over the rim of her glasses. Yes, Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. No insurance. No records on file, please. Of course. Take a seat. The doctor will see you shortly. Clara sank into a vinyl armchair, her hands clutching her tote bag against her stomach like a shield. She let out a long, shaky breath, feeling a false sense of relief settle over her. I did it, she thought, closing her eyes. No credit cards, no driver, no paper trail. I'm safe. She was completely oblivious to the sleek, blacked-out Cadillac Escalade idling across the street. Inside, Marco, Matteo Rossi's chief enforcer, lowered his binoculars and tapped his earpiece. Boss, Marco said, his voice flat and efficient. She's inside St. Jude's on 4th Street. Entered at 2:15 p.m. She paid cash at the desk. In the grand study of the Rossi estate, miles away, Matteo sat behind his mahogany desk. The ambient light caught the sharp angle of his jaw as his pitch-black eyes narrowed to lethal slits. A dark, terrifying thrill coiled in his chest. You thought you could slip away from me, mia caro? Hold the perimeter, Matteo commanded, his deep voice dropping to a gravelly purr. Get me the clinic owner on the line, now. Within 30 seconds, the panicked, breathless voice of Dr. Eris Thorne, the primary owner of St. Jude's, came through the encrypted line. Hello? Who is this? How did you get this number? Dr. Thorne, Matteo purred, resting his elbows on the desk and steepling his ringed fingers. I am Matteo Rossi, and you are currently sitting on a piece of real estate that I am buying. Mr. Rossi, I don't understand. My clinic isn't for sale. It is as of 5 seconds ago. Matteo cut him off, his tone shifting from smooth velvet to absolute steel. My bankers have just transferred $4 million into your corporate account. You are now an employee of the Rossi enterprise. And right now, a woman named Clara Vance is sitting in your examination room. A heavy, terrified silence stretched across the line. Thorne swallowed hard, the sound audible through the receiver. Mr. Rossi, patient confidentiality laws. If you mention ethics to me again, Harrison, Matteo interrupted coldly, I will have Marco burn your quiet little facility to the ground with you trapped inside. Now, listen carefully. My doctor will perform her ultrasound. You will print the original scans. You will hand every single file, photo, and digital record directly to Marco. If you mention my name to her, or if you make her feel self-conscious about her body in any way, I will personally ensure you never practice medicine again. Crystal clear, sir, Thorne stammered, his voice trembling violently. Good. Give her whatever vitamins she needs. Treat her like royalty. She is carrying my blood. Matteo ended the call and leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, possessive smirk spreading across his face. He picked up his fountain pen, tapping it against the desk. She thought she was running. She thought she was hiding, but every step she took only brought her deeper into his web. The heavy mahogany doors of the Rossi estate clicked shut behind Clara, sealing out the humid Chicago afternoon. She let out a long, trembling breath, her shoulders sagging under her oversized cardigan. Her canvas tote bag hung heavy on her arm, containing a small paper bag of prenatal vitamins and a single, hidden ultrasound photo she had begged the doctor for. A photo showing one tiny, fragile flutter of life. She took a slow, quiet step across the polished marble floor of the foyer, heading toward the narrow servant's staircase tucked behind the grand archway. She thought she had done it. She thought her cash-only visit had left no trail, that she had bought herself a few more weeks to pack her things and vanish into the countryside. Clara. The voice didn't come from the hallway. It echoed from the dark, cavernous depths of the private library to her left. Deep, velvet smooth, and dripping with an absolute, inescapable authority that made her knees turn to water. Clara froze, her sensible shoes locked against the marble. Her heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, she turned to face the heavy double doors of the library, standing half open. "In here," Matteo commanded softly. Clara swallowed down the lump in her throat, clutching her tote bag tightly against her stomach. She walked into the dim, leather-scented room. The afternoon sun barely seeped through the stained glass transoms, casting long, amber shadows across the floor-to-ceiling bookcases. Matteo stood near his obsidian desk, illuminated by the soft glow of a single brass desk lamp. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the dark ink of the tattoos trailing up his neck. But it was his face, his sharp, aristocratic features set in an expression of terrifying, possessive calm, that made Clara's breath hitch. "Close the doors," he murmured, his dark eyes never leaving her face. Clara turned and pushed the heavy oak doors shut. The latch clicked into place with a sound of utter finality. "Did you enjoy your afternoon off, Piccola?" Matteo asked, taking a slow, measured step toward her. The sheer gravity of his presence seemed to pull all the air out of the vast room. "Yes, Mr. Rossi," Clara squeaked, her voice betraying her. She cleared her throat quickly, taking a nervous step back until her spine met the cool wood of the closed doors. "Just ran a few personal errands." "Errands?" Matteo repeated, tasting the word on his tongue like bitter wine. He closed the distance between them, until he was standing a mere foot away. The familiar, intoxicating scent of sandalwood, expensive tobacco, and pure, concentrated power overwhelmed her senses. He didn't yell. He didn't demand answers. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his crisp trousers and pulled out a thick, unmarked manila envelope. Clara's eyes widened in terror. "You are a brilliant housekeeper, Clara," Matteo purred, his voice dropping an octave into a low, rumbling growl. "You keep my home spotless. You handle my estate with effortless grace. But you are a terrible liar. And you are a fool if you thought you could walk around my city carrying my blood without me knowing." I don't know what you mean," she whimpered, her hands trembling so hard her tote bag slipped to the floor with a soft thud. Matteo didn't answer with words. He extended his hand, pressing the heavy manila envelope into her numb fingers. With shaking hands, Clara pulled open the flap. Inside were glossy, high-definition thermal printouts, far clearer than the single blurry image tucked away in her bag. But as her eyes scanned the medical printouts, her breath caught completely in her throat. Her eyes welled with sudden, overwhelming confusion and tears. There wasn't just one gestational sac outlined on the high-tech scan. There were two. "Two," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "No," the doctor said. "The clinic tried to keep your records obscured, to satisfy your foolish little cash arrangement," Matteo interrupted softly, taking another step closer. He reached out, his large, calloused hand cupping her full jaw, his thumb gently tilting her head up, until her wide hazel eyes locked onto his pitch-black, possessive gaze. "They printed what you asked for, but I bought the entire facility 30 seconds after you walked through their front door. My doctors ran the real analysis." He leaned down, his face inches from hers, his hot breath brushing against her flushed skin. "2 heartbeats, Clara," he murmured, his dark eyes burning with a feral, territorial fire that made her core tremble. "You are carrying twins. 2 heirs to the Rossi empire. Please," Clara sobbed, a tear slipping down her soft, plush cheek. "Mr. Rossi, please. I didn't mean to trap you. I know what I am. I'm just a maid. I'm soft. I'm clumsy. I was going to leave. I swear I would never have asked you for a dime." "Leave?" Matteo snarled, the velvet in his voice instantly morphing into raw, dangerous steel. His grip on her jaw tightened, not enough to hurt, but enough to anchor her completely to him. "You think I care about money? You think I care about the starved, ambitious socialites my associates parade around?" His other hand shot out, wrapping around her thick waist and pulling her plush frame violently flush against his broad, rock-hard chest. Clara gasped at the sudden, overwhelming contact, her hands instinctively pressing against his shoulders. "I tasted you 9 weeks ago, Clara," he growled against her lips, his dark eyes blazing with an unhinged, absolute devotion. "I felt how soft, how lush, how perfect you are. I let you retreat to your quarters because I thought you needed time to process what happened between us. But running from my city? Trying to hide my children in some quiet backwater town?" He leaned in closer, pressing his forehead against hers, his voice a lethal, binding vow. "You are done hiding behind oversized sweaters and heavy aprons, Piccola. You are carrying my heirs. Your life as my quiet, invisible maid ends right now. You belong to me, both of you, all 3 of you, and you are never leaving my side again." The transformation of her life did not happen over weeks or days. It happened in less than an hour. Clara didn't even get the chance to return to the small staff quarters in the basement to collect her worn tote bag. Matteo kept his heavy arm wrapped around her soft waist, guiding her away from the servants' wing and straight up the grand marble staircase to the 3rd floor, a floor she had spent 2 years cleaning but had never been allowed to enter without a feather duster and a bucket of polish in hand. He pushed open the heavy double mahogany doors at the end of the corridor, ushering her into his private master suite. The space was massive, a breathtaking expanse of dark hardwoods, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the misty Chicago skyline, and a king-sized bed draped in deep charcoal linens. But what caught Clara's breath wasn't the sheer scale of the room or the reinforced bulletproof glass catching the afternoon light. It was what sat on the marble coffee table in the center of the sitting area. On the table lay a single black leather folder. Beside it, Marco stood silently, holding a fountain pen. As Matteo led Clara into the room, Marco gave a quiet, respectful nod. Not the distant nod he gave to the house staff, but a deep, deferential bow reserved strictly for family. "The lease on her apartment in Westtown has been officially terminated, boss," Marco reported in his low, gravelly tone. "Security deposit refunded. 3 months severance paid to her landlord to clear her belongings. Everything she owns of sentimental value has already been boxed and moved into the master closet. The rest has been cleared out." Clara's jaw dropped, her hazel eyes wide with disbelief as she looked up at Matteo. My apartment? You erased my apartment?" "I didn't erase it, Piccola," Matteo said smoothly, taking her trembling hand in his. "I closed a chapter. You don't live in a crumbling walk-up in Westtown anymore. You live here, with me." He nodded to Marco, who quietly exited the suite, pulling the heavy double doors shut behind him with a soft, final click. Before Clara could process the loss of her former life, Matteo took her hand and led her past the plush velvet sofa, toward the master suite's massive walk-in closet. The room was larger than her entire previous apartment. But instead of being filled with Matteo's dark, sharp, tailored suits, the right side of the closet was a glowing tapestry of soft colors and luxurious fabrics. Rows upon rows of custom-tailored silk loungewear, heavy cashmere robes, flowing velvet caftans, and delicate European maternity dresses hung from velvet-padded hangers. There were no stiff cotton uniforms, no frilled aprons, no oversized, shapeless sweaters designed to make a woman blend into the shadows. Every single piece was rich, soft, and impeccably cut, and every single tag read size 18. I had my personal shoppers clear out every high-end boutique in the city the second my surveillance flagged your search history for prenatal care last week," Matteo murmured, stepping behind her. His large, tattooed hands reached around her waist, gently untying the thick canvas apron she had worn like armor all morning. He let the stiff fabric hit the floor with a heavy thud. Clara stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat as he carefully unbuttoned her faded uniform dress, peeling it away from her shoulders until she stood in her plain, cotton undergarments. She instinctively wrapped her arms around her chest, trying to pull inward, her face burning with deep, ingrained shame. "Don't!" she whimpered, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "Please, Matteo! I'm soft. I'm clumsy. My thighs are thick. My stomach is already... I don't belong in silk. I'm not a model." "Clara," Matteo growled softly. He didn't pull her into a forced embrace. Instead, the fearsome Don, a man who made corrupt politicians tremble and ruled Chicago's underworld with an iron fist, did something that shattered Clara's heart into 1,000 pieces. He dropped to his knees in front of her. Clara gasped, taking a half-step back, but Matteo reached out, his large, heavily tattooed hands gently resting against the back of her plush thighs, anchoring her in place. A king bowing before his altar. "Do not ever insult my woman in front of me again," Matteo stated, his pitch-black eyes burning with a fierce, terrifying worship as he looked up at her. "I am surrounded by sharp, starving, ruthless people all day. I deal in concrete, blood, and cold ambition. You think I want to come home to a woman made of sharp angles?" He leaned forward, pressing a deep, lingering kiss directly through her thin cotton slip to the soft, rounded swell of her lower stomach, right where his twin heirs were growing. Clara shuddered, her fingers tangling instinctively into his dark, styled hair. "I want soft," Matteo declared, his rough hand slowly tracing the lush curve of her hips, his thumbs pressing into the deep, tender dip of her waist with absolute reverent awe. "I want lush. I want the only genuine, warm thing in this cold, violent city. For 2 years, I watched you hide this incredible, abundant body under ugly uniforms, thinking I didn't see you. But I saw everything, Clara. You are a masterpiece, and you are mine." He stood up slowly, towering over her once more, but the coldness in his eyes was entirely gone, replaced by a fierce, protective fire. He reached for a deep emerald-green silk robe from the hanger and draped it gently over her shoulders, wrapping the belt loosely around her soft waist. "Your maid duties are over," Matteo promised, his voice a low, binding vow as he kissed her flushed cheek. "You will never clean another floor. You will never answer to anyone in this city. You are the mother of my children, Piccola, and I am going to spend the rest of my life worshipping every single inch of you." The whispers had spread through the Chicago underworld like wildfire. The ruthless Matteo Rossi, a don who had spent a decade rejecting political marriages and turning down the daughters of powerful capos, had suddenly pulled a soft, unknown housemaid into his master suite. To the older syndicates, it wasn't romance. It was a sudden, dangerous weakness, a sign that the king of Chicago had grown soft, distracted by a civilian girl who didn't come with an army or a bloodline. Matteo knew the balance of power was shifting, and he had no intention of letting them whisper in the dark. "They think I brought a vulnerability into my home," Matteo growled softly, adjusting the silver cufflinks on his bespoke black tuxedo. He stood behind Clara in the master suite's dressing area, his pitch-black eyes locking onto her reflection in the full-length gilded mirror. "Tonight, I show them I brought a queen." Clara stood frozen, her breath shallow as she stared at her own reflection. Gone was the timid, invisible maid who hid behind stiff canvas aprons and oversized cardigans. In her place stood a vision of striking, opulent beauty. Matteo had dressed her for war. She wore a custom-tailored ruby-red silk gown that hugged every lush, voluptuous curve of her size 18 frame. The neckline plunged tastefully, accentuating her heavy breasts, while the heavy fabric cinched snugly just beneath her bust, falling in rich, weighted folds over the gentle, soft swell of her early pregnancy. Around her neck rested a multi-carat diamond necklace that glittered like shattered ice under the warm lights, matching the heavy diamond drops sweeping down from her ears. Her dark curls were pinned back in an elegant, voluminous updo, framing a face that was flushed, terrified, and breathtakingly beautiful. "Matteo," Clara whispered, her hazel eyes wide with panic, as her plump, manicured hands reached up to lightly touch the diamonds at her throat. "I don't belong there. These people, they're killers, capos, cartel bosses. They'll look at me and see a maid playing dress-up." Matteo leaned down, burying his face in the crook of her neck, his rough jaw scraping against her soft skin as he let out a low, dangerous growl. His large, heavily ringed hands reached around her waist, flattening over the smooth ruby silk of her belly. "Let them look," he purred against her skin, his voice dripping with an absolute, possessive dark power. "They are wolves, Piccola, but I am the monster that keeps the wolves in line. You don't bow to them, they will bow to you." The venue for the Syndicate Summit was an exclusive, subterranean club tucked beneath a historic hotel in the heart of downtown Chicago. The space was draped in heavy crimson velvet, illuminated by dimly lit crystal chandeliers, and filled with the suffocating scents of expensive Cuban cigars, aged scotch, and heavy cologne. Over 30 of the most lethal syndicate heads, capos, and high-ranking enforcers in the Midwest sat at a massive, polished mahogany round table in the center of the room. When the heavy iron-reinforced doors at the back of the venue swung open, the low hum of dangerous conversation died down instantly. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. Matteo walked in first, his posture tall, imposing, and radiating an aura of cold, lethal authority. But he didn't walk alone. His heavy, tattooed arm was draped tightly around Clara's soft waist, pulling her flush against his side as he guided her toward the head of the table. Clara felt 30 pairs of cold, calculating, and murderous eyes snap onto her. She felt the heavy judgment in the air, the subtle sneers from the older capos, and the visual inspection of her soft, voluptuous figure. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, her thick thighs rubbing beneath the heavy ruby silk as she struggled to keep her chin up. Matteo pulled out the velvet-upholstered throne chair at the head of the table, waiting patiently until Clara sat down before taking his own seat beside her. He didn't offer a polite introduction. He simply rested one large, tattooed hand over Clara's, on the polished wood, his pitch-black eyes slowly scanning the room full of killers like a predator counting his prey. "Gentlemen," Matteo rumbled, his voice cutting through the thick silence like a blade. "Eat, drink, we have empire business to discuss, and a queen to introduce." The heavy scent of roasted meats, vintage Barolo, and rich tobacco filled the subterranean room, but the atmosphere remained thick enough to slice with a razor. Around the long banquet table, men who commanded private armies and controlled city blocks ate in tense silence, their eyes darting nervously toward the head of the table. Clara sat tall in her velvet-upholstered chair, the multi-carat diamond necklace heavy against her collarbone. Her hand rested beneath Matteo's large, scarred palm. Though her pulse still raced, the sheer, protective aura radiating from the man beside her gave her a steadying anchor. She took a sip of her sparkling water, forcing herself to meet the sharp, calculating glares of the capos scattered around the room. Halfway down the table sat Don Giuseppe Moretti, a grizzled, iron-jawed veteran who controlled the South Side docks and had long sought to marry off his own daughter to Matteo to seal a union between their territories. Giuseppe swirled his scotch, his thick gray eyebrows furrowed in deep, visible disgust as his gaze dragged over Clara's plush shoulders and the rich ruby silk hugging her voluptuous waist. "A toast," Giuseppe suddenly announced, his raspy voice breaking the quiet like gravel grinding beneath a boot. He didn't stand up, merely raising his glass with a cold, mocking smirk. "To Don Rossi, and to his unexpected choice." A few capos shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the sudden drop in temperature, but Giuseppe pressed on, emboldened by his own arrogance. "We all expected an alliance, Matteo, a strategic bond between bloodlines to strengthen Chicago," Giuseppe continued, his eyes locking onto Clara with open condescension. "Instead, you parade a soft, heavy distraction in front of us, a former housemaid wearing diamonds. She looks built for domestic comfort, Rossi, not for holding the throne of an empire." A collective gasp was swallowed across the room. Several underbosses subtly leaned back, placing space between themselves and Giuseppe, anticipating the blast radius. Clara's cheeks burned hot with a flash of humiliation, her fingers tightening instinctively around her napkin. But before the shame could take root, she felt Matteo's grip on her hand tighten. Not in anger toward her, but with a terrifying, absolute calm. Matteo didn't yell. He didn't slam his glass down. He slowly picked up a heavy, silver-handled steak knife from his plate, inspecting the razor-sharp edge in the ambient light of the crystal chandelier. Then, with the languid, terrifying grace of a panther, he stood up. The entire room went dead silent. Nobody dared to breathe. Matteo walked around the long mahogany table, the soft thud of his Italian leather shoes echoing against the concrete floor like a march to an execution. Giuseppe's smug smile began to falter, a bead of cold sweat forming at his temple, though he tried to maintain his tough facade. Matteo stopped directly behind Giuseppe's chair. "Giuseppe," Matteo whispered, leaning down until his lips were inches from the older man's ear. His voice was dangerously soft, dripping with lethal velvet. "You have known me for 15 years. You know I do not make mistakes, and you know I do not tolerate insolence." "Just an observation, Matteo," Giuseppe stammered, raising his hands defensively. "We are businessmen." In a blur of motion too fast for the eye to track, Matteo's hand shot out. He grabbed Giuseppe by his silver hair, violently slamming the man's head backward against the high leather chair. Before Giuseppe could even scream, Matteo brought the heavy steak knife down with bone-crushing force, driving the thick steel blade straight through Giuseppe's right hand and pinning it flat to the polished mahogany table. A blood-curdling shriek tore from Giuseppe's throat as blood spattered across the white linen tablecloth. Instantly, 3 of Giuseppe's bodyguards reached into their tailored jackets for their firearms, but the metallic sound of 30 weapon slides racking echoed through the room. Marco and a dozen of Matteo's elite enforcers stepped out of the shadows, their silenced submachine guns aimed directly at the heads of every capo at the table. "Sit down," Matteo roared, the sound vibrating through the walls like a thunderclap. Giuseppe's guards slowly raised their hands, backing away, while the rest of the syndicate bosses sat frozen in sheer terror. Matteo leaned down over the table, his hand resting firmly on the hilt of the embedded knife, twisting it slightly. Giuseppe let out a choked sob, his face pale and contorted in agony. "You look at my woman, and you see a distraction," Matteo growled, his pitch-black eyes burning with an unhinged, feral devotion that made the hardest killers in Chicago tremble. "I look at her, and I see my sanctuary, my strength. She is carrying the Rossi bloodline. Her body is sacred. Her softness is the only piece of mercy I possess in this filthy world." He pulled the knife free in one swift motion, letting Giuseppe collapse forward onto the blood-stained wood. Matteo straightened his cuffs, turning his icy, terrifying gaze upon the rest of the room. "If anyone in this room," Matteo announced, his voice ringing out like a death sentence, "ever speaks a word against my wife's size, her background, or her place by my side, I will not just end you, I will erase your entire bloodline from the face of this earth. Is that understood?" "Understood, Don Rossi," a chorus of trembling voices answered in immediate, terrified unison. Matteo tossed the bloodied knife onto a silver tray held by an enforcer. He turned back toward the head of the table, his expression instantly softening as his dark eyes found Clara. Clara was breathing heavily, her heart pounding, but as she looked at the man who had just subjugated the entire underworld purely to defend her honor, something inside her shifted permanently. The timid, insecure maid who hid in the shadows died in that room. When Matteo reached her side, offering his hand, Clara didn't shrink away. She reached out, her soft, plump hand wrapping firmly around his scarred knuckles. "Thank you, my love," Clara said, her voice clear, rich, and resonant, carrying across the silent room. A dark, triumphant smirk played on Matteo's lips. He brought her hand to his mouth, pressing a tender kiss to her knuckles while keeping eye contact with the room. "Eat, gentlemen," Matteo commanded softly, pulling out Clara's chair as she sat back down with the posture of an absolute monarch. "We have an empire to run." The hum of medical equipment vibrated softly through the estate's private medical wing, a state-of-the-art facility built behind reinforced steel doors on the sub-level of the mansion. At 33 weeks pregnant, Clara's belly was a high, heavy, and beautiful curve that stretched the fine emerald cashmere of her maternity dress. Dr. Harrison, the personal physician Matteo had placed on a permanent retainer, smiled softly as he moved the ultrasound wand over her plush, gel-covered stomach. On the high-definition monitor above, 2 tiny, distinct heartbeats echoed through the room like a steady, rhythmic drumbeat. "Blood pressure is crisp, Mrs. Rossi, and both babies are growing remarkably well," Dr. Harrison murmured, wiping the excess gel from her skin. "You are in perfect health." Standing near the heavy door, arms crossed over his broad chest, Matteo's hard, aristocratic features melted into a look of pure, unadulterated adoration. He stepped forward, leaning down to press a deep, tender kiss against the crown of her head. "They're going to be as strong as their mother," Matteo purred softly, his rough thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. Before Clara could answer, a muffled explosion rocked the subterranean hallway, followed instantly by the sharp, terrifying chatter of automatic gunfire. The lights flickered and plunged into a stark red emergency glow. Dr. Harrison gasped, dropping his clipboard. while Matteo's expression shifted instantly from gentle devotion to pure, lethal fury. He drew his custom sidearm from his shoulder holster in a single fluid motion. "Stay behind the desk," Matteo growled to Clara, his voice dropping into an absolute command. "Marco is holding the upper staircase. I will be back in 2 minutes." "Matteo, wait," Clara started, but he was already out the door, joining the violent firefight, echoing in the corridor outside. Dr. Harrison scrambled into the corner, his hands shaking violently as he tried to hide behind a supply cabinet. Clara didn't cower. The timid maid who fled at the first sign of trouble was gone. In her place stood a mother carrying 2 heirs, her heart hammering with fierce protective instinct. Suddenly, the heavy reinforced door burst inward with a sickening metallic crunch. 2 men dressed in tactical gear and black balaclavas rushed into the room, their assault rifles raised. They weren't Matteo's men, and they bore the brutal markings of a rival syndicate's hired hit squad. "Clear the room," one of the mercenaries barked, his rifle snapping toward Dr. Harrison. A suppressed double tap cut the doctor down before he could scream. The second mercenary turned his gaze toward Clara, his eyes narrowing as he stepped toward her heavy, pregnant frame. "Grab the woman. Don Rossi's prized distraction dies today." Maternal rage, hot and unyielding, flooded Clara's veins. As the mercenary lunged forward to grab her arm, Clara didn't back away. Her hand shot out, grabbing a heavy, solid brass medical tray, resting on the stainless steel counter beside her. With a guttural, primal cry of pure fury, she swung the heavy tray with all her strength, slamming the solid metal edge directly into the mercenary's jaw. The crunch of breaking bone echoed through the room. The force of the strike shattered the man's mask and knocked him violently off his feet, his rifle clattering across the tile floor. The remaining mercenary froze in utter shock, stunned that a pregnant civilian had just laid out a trained killer. That 1-second delay was all the time needed. A shadow moved through the doorway with terrifying, non-human speed. Matteo breached the room not as a man but as an apex predator defending his den. He didn't fire his weapon. He closed the distance instantly, grabbing the remaining mercenary by the throat with one massive hand and driving him violently into the concrete wall. The impact shattered the man's spine before Matteo snapped his neck with a swift, brutal twist. Without breaking stride, Matteo dropped the lifeless mercenary to the floor, spun around, and used his sidearm to finish the downed attacker Clara had struck. In under 30 seconds, the medical bay fell dead silent once more, save for the hum of the red emergency lights. Matteo dropped his weapon, rushing across the room to fall on his knees before Clara. His large, heavily tattooed hands frantically checked her thick thighs, her massive belly, and her shoulders, his voice raw with a panic no one in the underworld had ever heard from him before. "Clara!" "Piccola, look at me," he growled frantically, his chest heaving. "Are you hit? Did they touch you? Are you bleeding?" I'm okay," Clara gasped, her hands shaking as she dropped the bloody brass tray to the floor. She collapsed forward against his chest, her arms wrapping tightly around his neck. "I kept them away from the babies, Matteo. I protected them." Matteo crushed her generous, plush frame against his heart, burying his face in her neck. The ruthless tyrant was trembling like a leaf, holding her soft body as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. "You fought like a queen," Matteo choked out, his dark eyes burning with demonic promise as he kissed her damp forehead. I have you, my love, and I am going to burn every street in this city until there is nothing left of the men who sent them." The sudden, agonizing cramp hit Clara before the adrenaline of the attack had even begun to fade. A sharp gasp tore from her throat as a hot gush of fluid soaked through her emerald cashmere dress, splashing onto the cold tiles of the medical bay. "Matteo," she choked out, her fingers digging wildly into the fabric of his dark vest as another wave of pressure folded her in half. "My water, it's too early. The babies are coming now." Matteo's face went dead pale. "Marco," he roared toward the doorway. "Clear the upper floors. Get the backup medical team down here now." Within minutes, the subterranean bay was flooded with a secondary trauma unit. The mansion was placed on maximum lockdown. Over 200 heavily armed Rossi soldiers barricaded the gates and surrounding streets, turning the estate into an impenetrable fortress. While the medical staff scrambled to prepare the delivery suite, Matteo stood beside Clara's bed, stripping off his blood-stained jacket and rolling his sleeves up to his elbows. He didn't care about the chaos outside. He didn't care about the blood on his boots. His large, tattooed hand wrapped around Clara's trembling fingers, anchoring her completely. He pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing Marco on speaker, while keeping his pitch-black eyes locked onto Clara's flushed, tear-streaked face. "Boss," Marco's voice rasped through the speaker over the heavy chatter of automatic gunfire. "We secured the perimeter. Execute the purge," Matteo commanded, his voice cold, flat, and dripping with absolute finality. "Every family that backed this hit, every capo, every associate connected to Giuseppe Moretti, erase them all before sunrise. Leave nothing behind." "Consider it done," Marco replied, before the line went dead. Across Chicago, Matteo's wrath was executed with terrifying precision. But inside the quiet sanctuary of the delivery room, the ruthless Don melted away into a fiercely protective partner. He held Clara's heavy, plush leg, brushing dark, damp curls from her forehead as she pushed through the brutal, premature labor. "I can't, Matteo, I'm so tired," Clara sobbed, her face swollen and flushed, her voluptuous body utterly exhausted after hours of agony. "Look at me, Piccola," Matteo commanded fiercely, taking her face in his large hands and forcing her hazel eyes to meet his burning, possessive gaze. "You fought off a killer to protect our sons. You are the strongest thing in this entire city. Push for me, my love. Give me our boys." With a primal scream that echoed through the reinforced walls, Clara bore down one final time. A sudden, breathless silence fell over the room, instantly broken by a sharp, piercing cry, followed seconds later by a second, equally frantic roar. Clara collapsed back against the pillows, tears of pure relief spilling over her soft cheeks. The lead physician quickly cleaned the two tiny infants, wrapping them in soft blankets before bringing them over. He handed them not to the nurses, but directly to Matteo. The terrifying tyrant of Chicago, a man who had just ordered the total annihilation of his enemies across the city without blinking, stared down at the two tiny squalling bundles resting in his massive, tattooed arms. Hot, heavy tears spilled over Matteo's dark lashes, running down his sharp cheekbones. He dropped to his knees beside Clara's hospital bed, carefully resting the newborn twins against her soft, heaving chest. "Look what you gave me," Matteo wept softly, pressing his lips repeatedly against Clara's damp hair, his voice breaking completely. "Look at our perfect boys." Clara looked down at the two tiny faces, a perfect blend of her soft features and Matteo's sharp intensity. She wrapped her plush arms around her sons, holding them against her chest. She was exhausted, battered, and her life would never again resemble the simple, quiet existence she once knew. She would always have armed escorts. She would live in a fortified, bulletproof world. But as she looked at the most dangerous man in Chicago, kneeling at her bedside, crying as he worshipped her hands, she knew the truth. She wasn't a prisoner in a gilded cage. She was the absolute ruler of the man who ruled the city. If this story gave you chills, welcome to the family. This is exactly the kind of story we tell here. Subscribe, drop a comment telling me what you'd have named the twins, and I'll see you in the next one. "What are their names, my queen?" Matteo whispered, his dark eyes filled with endless, unyielding devotion. Clara smiled through her tears, running a hand over Matteo's styled hair. "Leo and Matteo Jr., she murmured softly, "the future kings of Chicago." Matteo leaned up, capturing her lips in a deep, breathless, and possessive kiss. "Long live the queen," he growled gently against her mouth. Clara kissed him back, resting her soft hand over his scarred knuckles. "And long live the king."